campaigning. So you started out with saying that usually you don't believe in campaigning. Once in a while you did campaign, not that aggressively, but in a way when you cover a story for a very long period of time, you are starting to get into the terrain of campaigning. And then you said that the reason you went into campaigning because in some cases this is the only way to go. And so tell me about this decision to go to campaigning, and what does it mean to do campaign in a newspaper, and what are the risks that you're carrying when you're campaigning, and why do you think that we must, as you said, break the conventions in journalism and go to campaigning?
Well, I think it's partly, I mean, people mean different things by campaigning. So sometimes people mean of a campaign. A newspaper campaign is just, you know, a newspaper may cover something for 3 or 4 years and they don't let go of it. So, you know, the Sunday Times did a big thing on what was the name of the cricket cyclist who won the Tour de France? Lance Armstrong, yes. So, you know, they just kept on at him, and that could be a newspaper campaign because they wouldn't let go. This was a different campaign. It was adopting the techniques of political campaigning and allying it to reporting. And normally I would be cautious about that because I'm normally on the side of people who just say a newspaper should give the public the facts. But I do think it worked in this one because to my mind, the balance between the skeptics and the convinced scientists is so large, and reporting just wasn't doing it. The second thing is I think social media has changed the nature of campaigning. So if you can enlist hundreds of thousands of people and find ways of using them and tapping into that energy, I think you know people are learning how that works, and newspapers could be seen as being rather old-fashioned for ignoring all that and saying, well, that's not what we do. We just write articles. So I think I thought it was an interesting thing to experiment with.
So the readers that created this video clip, and many people who are very much interested in climate change were very enthusiastic about this campaign. But I guess that there are some people in the newsroom and some readers that were less enthusiastic about The Guardian being all of a sudden a campaigner. Can you describe the dynamics there?
Well, the funny thing was I kept expecting to be hit over the head. But I mean, I particularly thought the American press would be very cross with us. And we did, I think there was a slide there which showed I did about 15 interviews with lots of American press outlets. And they were interested, they were curious, but nobody actually. Well, there were a couple of sour pieces. The Financial Times wrote a sour piece, but generally people were interested. So, and the readers, not at all. There was no pushback from the readers at all. Newsroom, I'm sure there was some people who didn't think it was a great idea, but it wasn't sort of a big discussion at morning conference. Why are we doing this? I thought it was. Most people thought that's really interesting.
So the American journalists, the American media outlets, the newspapers are very suspicious of campaigning. Mm-hmm. They have this notion of objectivity, to be impartial. Mm-hmm. And the last time in the history of this country where journalists were campaigning all over this country was 100 years ago in the era of the muckrakers, where they were campaigning, they were waging a war against what Supreme Court Judge Louis Brandeis called the oligarchy that controlled the United States economy, and they thought that they should be campaigning, and they had a business model for a brief period of time that was able to sustain this campaign. Do you see any similarities in a way why many journalists in the United States 100 years ago felt that they should do campaigning, and why you feel at this point of time that we should be campaigning for climate change or for any other things, that we should use different tools? Because
I suppose I suppose in a British context, the tabloids used to be the campaigning papers. There was a great British editor, Hugh Cudlip, who was the editorial director of the Mirror, and he would do big shock issues on the National Health Service or on education or on poverty, and that was a tradition in the British tabloids, right up till I would say 20 years ago, and I think as sort of celebrity culture grew and the tabloids became more interested in private lives and celebrity culture, that tradition of campaigning fell away a bit. It happens sometimes in the British tabloids, but not so much. I don't know about the American. Does the New York Post or New York Daily News has had some fairly campaigning front pages recently, hasn't it? But probably not backed up by actual what one would call campaigns.
Yeah. So I'd like to read to you something that Michael Messing is a prominent American journalist, and he wrote a piece in the. He was the editor of the Columbia Journalism Review, and he wrote an article, a long article about how to fix American journalism last year. And we talked about campaigns. So he writes, clearly the economic travails of the news business have reduced its appetite for major projects, but this explains only so much. More important, perhaps, is the fear that many American journalists have of appearing partisan or one-sided. In a Q&A with the Columbia Journalism Review, Alan Swartz, that's another journalist, specifically mentioned his aversion to being labeled a crusader. This passion is incredibly powerful in a reporter, he said. It drives people crazy if I come off as somebody who's trying to change football, I lose something. If you stray too far, people cut you off. And then he writes, yet showing passion doesn't mean having to jettison principles like fairness and giving all sides their say. Perhaps the term campaigner is better than crusader, in the, especially how the Crusaders turned out. In the end, though, reporters must be willing to live with such labels. It's the price of letting their indignation show. Ultimately, the main obstacle to truly groundbreaking reporting is intellectual. American journalists need to break free of their current constricting emphasis on expose and scoops and adopt a more expensive program that seeks to bear the underlying realities of money, power, and influence in America to show how things really work. Would you agree this is what journalists...
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I began by saying, I've been quite sparing in campaigning because I don't think it's appropriate to everything. So, on genetically modified food, for instance, I don't feel I know where the scientific opinion has settled. So I think the most useful thing there was actually a British newspaper that did campaign against, it called it Frankenstein food, and tried to stop that. I feel I don't know enough about it, and so therefore I would not use campaigning for that. I would say, look, I will try and guide you through this issue. But I think it's equally legitimate for newspapers when they are convinced about injustice or inequality or impending catastrophe, to change the register and say, look, this is something, to shake the reader by the lapels, and do something different. So I think if you overdo it, then you're right. You will lose trust and you lose effect. But if you use it sparingly but powerfully, it seems to me entirely legitimate.
Mm-hmm. And were you targeting more the audience or more, in a way, the elites? You were basically targeting Bill Gates in many ways. We want Bill Gates to know that...
well, again, I think it was very powerful. I read the letters that they were writing to the Wellcome Trust Board and the Bill Gates Board, and I would not have personally liked to have been a Wellcome trustee receiving these letters, because they weren't journalistic letters. These were from grandmothers, from children, from parents, from nurses, and they were just written very honestly and powerfully. And I would have found those quite disturbing documents. So it was, in a way, mobilizing the readership and harnessing the power that lay there to go beyond just newspaper slogans and headlines, which is, again, something that I think modern campaigners understand. Since the advent of social media, when it's so easy to harness people who feel passionately about a particular form of injustice or something like climate change. So I think newspapers shouldn't just wall themselves off from that and say, well, that's what you do, that's not what we do. Allying the two seems to be potent.
So you said that actually this campaign was not about science anymore. It was bigger than that. You said it was an economic issue, a social issue. Can we take it one level of abstractions higher and say that climate change, the story of climate change is the story of the power of large corporations in democracy?
Well, that's obviously a big part of it. I mean, I think if as a news editor you said, actually, I'm not going to cover climate change through the sayings of scientists, but whatever it is that my readers are worried about, it is bound to have a climate change aspect to it. So, in Britain at the moment, there's a big debate about immigration because of this huge tidal wave of people coming through Europe from North Africa, which some people think is a climate change story. And then you say, well, if immigration is the thing that you worry about, immigration is going to become much, much, much worse over the next 20 or 30 years as large parts of Africa become much less inhabitable. So if you think it's bad now, just think what immigration is going to look like. If it's security that you're worried about, if it's jobs, if it's if it's water, whatever, if it's disease, whatever you think about, those problems are going to be greatly exacerbated in years to come. So that would be another way of writing about climate change, but through different prisms without constantly arguing about the science.
So when we look at
corporate behavior is obviously part of that, because that is generating a lot of the
But it's not only corporate behavior. Corporate behavior is a derivative of the power that corporations have over politicians and governments. Very difficult to change the status quo, which so many people are benefiting from it. So we have today three kind of big influential newspapers and media companies. We have the one controlled by large corporations or families or conglomerates. We have the media outlets that are controlled by governments. And then we have the Guardian. So can you describe to us the corporate structure and the ownership of the Guardian and how does it work?
Yeah. So in 1932, a miraculous thing happened, which the reason why this is so rare is that the Scott family, which had owned the Guardian since 1821, decided to give it away. Essentially, they put it into a trust with an endowment because they thought that there was a moral aspect to a newspaper. It was a sort of instrument of power, even of government, was the way they phrased it, which I don't think is quite right. And that trust then built a company to sustain the Guardian, because papers like the Guardian quite often don't make money, they even make losses, and they felt they needed a sort of rainy day fund, so they built up some companies, and the Scott Trust sits there and as the hinge and gives the Guardian the money when it needs it, which sort of is a bit like sort of Rupert Murdoch. His posh papers don't make money, but the tabloids do, so he cross finances them. But the crucial thing about the Scott Trust is that the Scott Trust is constitutionally forbidden ever to discuss the content with the editor. So as editor of the Guardian, you sit there with this body behind you, and nobody can ever nobble you. So during the Snowden affair, various MPs desperately wanted the Guardian to stop writing about that, and they wrote to the Scott Trust and said, "Stop him." And the Scott Trust said, "We can't. We're not allowed to discuss it with him." And that's what makes The Guardian unique. So there is nobody sitting above the editor who you have to look up at and think, I wonder what he thinks about what we should be writing. Your only conversation is with your colleagues and with your readers, and that makes The Guardian a very different kind of newspaper.
Correct me if I'm wrong, under this same specific corporate governance, you could also have developed a different culture and different norms. And because in many places we see the same corporate governance structures in companies, foundations, and totally different behavior. So it's not only the legalistic and the economical way of arranging this newspaper. What is it about the culture of this organization and its leadership and its employees, and how do you compare it to other media outlets?
Well, I mean, crudely, if Rupert Murdoch owns you, and you're a Rupert Murdoch editor, you're very interested in what Rupert Murdoch thinks. I would guess that every Rupert Murdoch editor subscribes to his Twitter feed. I'm just guessing, so that when Rupert Murdoch says something about Europe or about Donald Trump or whatever, they sit there and think, so that's what the great man thinks. And it would be a brave Rupert Murdoch editor who said, well, that's what he thinks, but I think differently, and I'm going to do this with my paper, and I'm going to be very pro-Europe, because you probably wouldn't be in a job for long. So you are thinking like that. If you're not thinking like that, then, as I say, you begin the day by thinking, well, I'm not going to be guided by that. Probably I'm going to send the reporters out, and we will build this as a sort of bottom-up news organization, because it would be interesting if they went out and told us what's happening, so that we could build our opinions from what's happening rather than about what we should think. So that in principle, is how I would describe the different organizational principle.
So you mentioned Rupert Murdoch, and one of the biggest stories that The Guardian had in the last decade, of course, was the story of the news of the world. And if you read the reporting in the news in The Guardian about the news on the world for several years, you are sort of, in many ways, terrified, because the behavior at the Murdoch newspapers and the way, in many ways, you think that democracy, all the institutions in the UK democracy, and maybe also in the United States, failed when they had to hold the Murdoch empire to account.
Yeah, well, it was an alarming moment, I think, in sort of democratic health. So Murdoch owned at that point 40% of the British press, of the national press, and that's a very dominant position. And he wanted various things from government. He wanted the go-ahead to buy the rest of Sky TV, which is a very profitable TV company. So what he had was this very profitable TV company. He had the posh papers and he had the tabloids. And what turned out to be the case, which was the story that we wrote, was that the tabloids were using criminal methods in order to get at the private lives of people. And so if you're a politician or a policeman or a regulator, or even a journalist, and you think, do I want to take this company on or go against it in any way? In the back of your mind would be this thought, I don't really want to be on the front page of next week's News of the World. And nobody could really work out why Murdoch's papers were so brilliant at getting into their sex scandals and their private lives. And it turns out because they had criminals sitting there bugging the phones, hacking into their phones. And so that made him somebody who had effective impunity. So when we started writing these stories, the police said, oh, well, we'll go and have an inquiry, and they came back 3 hours later and said, we've had our inquiry, there's nothing to find. The regulator unbelievably came out and said The Guardian was at fault and the News of the World was fine. They had to apologize for that 2 years later. No MPs wanted to speak about it. The rest of the press didn't want to cover it. So you had all the checks and balances which you think in a democratic society would work, failed. And that made it a very interesting story about power and the nature of power, and it was an alarming story. Happily,
Can you share with us some of the difficult moments that the Guardian, and specifically you as the editor-in-chief, had in this period of time when you were exposing what's happening in the News Corp?
Well, it's a very aggressive company. So there was a lot of aggression coming back towards the Guardian and at us. And if you do that in a vacuum in which you look around for support and there is no support, wouldn't be true to say no support from anybody, but there was very little support. Everyone ran for cover, basically. And so you're suddenly very exposed. You've stuck your bamboo stick into the hornet's nest, and there's a lot of very angry hornets around, and there's no one around to help you. So that was quite unnerving. And there was a period of about a year when it was just us. It was just Nick, who's fantastic reporter, very brave, and just got the story absolutely nailed. He was actually being helped by the News of the World staff. They felt so soiled by what they were being asked to do that they went to him to get him to stop it. And then what happened was that the New York Times got interested in the story, and they sent 4 reporters over to Britain who worked on the story for about 6 months, and they essentially validated everything that we had said. And then it became a difficult story for the British establishment to ignore, because the New York Times is the New York Times.
So what does it tell us about, this is the United Kingdom. So if there was such a long period of time where you were going out with those exposés and nobody would back you up and nobody would join you and nobody would do any follow-up. So what does it tells us about journalism?
Well, I mean, it wasn't great. I mean, I often think there clearly was a reluctance to cover the Murdoch company, and this is not just true of Murdoch. I think journalists find it awkward to write about other journalists. If this were a car company or a bank or a pharmaceutical company, or if it was the BBC, God forbid, the British press would have been all over it, and there would have been, demands that the board was sacked, the chairman was sacked, the chief executive was sacked. But there was a silence about this, and I suppose that the kindest way of putting it is that a feeling that you don't wash your dirty linen in public, and that this was in some way letting the side down.
For an economist, it would sound like some sort of a tacit collusion between the media moguls and their editors, in a way.
Mm. Possibly. They wouldn't they wouldn't have told me if it was. But I mean, since then we've learned that at Mirror Group newspapers the same thing was going on, and it maybe to a worse extent. And so there may have been a factor that other newspapers thought, well, we don't want to start writing about that because who knows where it would lead.
Mm-hmm. But today we are in 2016, and Rebecca Brooks was acquitted, and Rupert Murdoch is still the #1 owner of newspapers around the world, and hundreds of millions of people read their these newspapers and cable television and so on every day, and they carry a lot of influence. So, in terms of, if we go back to the campaigning, that you judge yourself not only about revealing facts, but also about changing reality, how can we...
Well, a number of people did go to jail. News Corporation had to pay out hundreds of thousands of pounds in damages and costs. Mirror Group newspapers have had to spend tens of thousands of pounds hundreds of thousands of pounds in damages. So a thing that was in danger of getting out of control, this criminal behaviour in the British press was stopped in its tracks. The Leveson inquiry was set up to look into that. There's a better system of regulation. I would be astonished if British journalists were behaving in a criminal way now. So, all that's good. And, the purpose wasn't to try and, to put Rupert Murdoch out of business. In many ways, he's been a good owner of titles. And but if he's going to do that in a way that is consistent with British law and values, then that's a good result.
But given what's happening in terms of the economic trends in the media world, and specifically with newspapers, and as we know, it is still, at the end of the day, in 2016, most of the investigative work, most of the important journalistic work is done at the same few print publication. They have websites and so on, but in the end of the day, if we look at the advent of the internet, it is still the same old institution, usually print newspapers, that are doing most of the work. If we look today at what's happening, can we say that the news media is less institutionally corrupt? Can we say that? Have we?
Yeah, well, as I said, that sort of criminal element has gone, I hope. Occasionally you get flashes where you learn that some newspapers are behaving in a sort of ethical ways that would not have been recognizable, 20 years ago. There was a big story about the Daily Telegraph, suppressing stories about banks because of the complicated relationships with either advertisers or the proprietors. And I don't think that would have happened 20 years ago on the Daily Telegraph. I just don't think it would. But I don't know if that's a widespread thing or whether that's a harbinger of worse kinds of behavior as the economics of newspapers get worse, and that it's a very serious situation.
So the Scott Trust still has about £1 billion or billion US dollars.
Roughly £1 billion. Yeah.
£1 billion, and with the rate of losses of the Guardian today, you can still run at least 10 to 20 years, and at least so. Have we figured out the business model, or we should all be looking for Scott Trusts?
Well, I think the truth is, if you set aside the financial titles, Financial Times and the Wall Street Journal, because it's easy to make people pay for financial news, and you set aside the New York Times, which is kind of sui generis, and you look around the rest of the world and say, can anybody put their hand on their heart and say they've cracked the business model? I think the truth is none of us have. And it changes very quickly. In the last few months, Facebook is taking millions and millions and millions of dollars, and so is Google. They're cleaning up, and traditional news organizations are suffering. But that's a snapshot in time. I think there are huge structural changes. Nobody saw ad blockers 2 or 3 years ago, and nobody saw the flight to mobile 5 years ago. Nobody predicted the fact that Facebook would become the internet for many people. So 10 years ago, the social media revolution was barely happening. So I would say nobody has yet found the economic model, but I will continue to insist on the value of journalism. And you try to imagine a society without journalism, without a reliable, verifiable source of news, and that's a frightening society.
Yeah, so I wouldn't bet necessarily on the value of journalism, because the value of journalism is for the entire society, and you know that economics usually works when there is incentives and value for specific institution and people. And in a way, you mentioned Facebook. we are in a much worse situation today as media, because unlike the BPs and the Chevrons or the banks, Facebook and Google and Apple are not only the biggest corporations in the world, they are also our platform. And more of our traffic and more of our readers hear about what we're doing, read about what we're doing, know about what we're doing just by going to Facebook and Google and Apple. And so pretty soon we'll find yourself in a situation that it is very difficult to report and to hold to account the most influential companies in the world.
Yeah, well, I mean, these are the real dilemmas that all people in media are now having to sort out. I mean, you can't. When Facebook started these Facebook instant news about 9 months ago, incredibly recent. Could any news organization realistically stay off it? Probably not, because so much of our audience is there, and that's how they experience our news. So it would be a brave person to say, well, actually, we're not going to be on Facebook, because you would be denying yourself up to a third of your audience, well, maybe more in some cases. And so you put your content on Facebook. You have a nice agreement with Facebook that Facebook are going to give you the revenues to begin with. But at that moment, you are handing yourself into people who own the algorithm, who will decide how much of your news is going to be seen, and who are then your platform. So it's a huge decision, but it would be a huge decision not to be on Facebook.
So it feels as if we are in a period of time where we need independent journalism more than we ever needed it on one hand. On the other hand, the contempt for, and sometimes the hate for media and for journalists is in a way all-time high. We have Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, each of them for different reasons, attacking media in most of their speeches. So how are we going to, as scientists, as intellectuals, as journalists, as academics, how are we going to come together and revive journalism and make sure that there is a future for journalism?
Yeah. Well, maybe this takes us a bit back into the thing that I was talking about earlier, that I don't think it's enough for journalists just to stand by and say, well, journalism is this thing. You know, journalism was done like this in 1821, and journalism is about writing words down that we then hand to our readers. That's part of what journalism is. But if you look at the things that engage people and energize people and excite people in terms of the publishing information infrastructure of the way the world is now organized, there are things that people do consider vital and necessary to their lives. And I think we as journalists need to learn quite quickly what those things are, and that don't compromise the essential truths of journalism. And maybe there ought to be more people trying these sort of hybrid experiments of news and campaigning, or news and social media, to make journalism seem more relevant and not something that you can just lump with some kind of beltway elite and say that's journalism, that's bad. It's a sort of corporate corrupt activity, because most journalism isn't. Some of it is.
So let's try to end with an optimistic note. It's in your hands now. So looking back at your career in journalism and where you are today, are you more optimistic or less optimistic about the state of the state? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I do find that the sort of shift. I mean, we haven't talked about the shift of power from journalism to people. which is obvious. I mean, if you allow everybody in this room could go out tonight and tweet or post or blog or photograph or broadcast what's going on, that is an extraordinarily liberating thing. So everybody in this room could engage in a form of journalism. And that is obviously such a shift of power from the people on the platform being the only people. I mean, I think that has to be good, and that has to be democratizing and energizing. But there are things that journalists are rather good at, and it is a skill which is not always easy, but is incredibly necessary. And I do look at some of the things that politicians are getting away with at the moment, and corporations, and saying, actually, if there was proper journalism reporting on the consequences of this, these things would not be allowable. There would be better political decisions and better companies. And if you went into the dark with journalism not being there to verify this stuff, then we're getting into a very dangerous time. But I don't feel. I mean, I'm worried about the economic thing. Obviously, I am. But I think the techniques and the shift in power, and the extraordinary new media and platforms and devices and conversations and interactions and challenges that are going on in this new world are not wholly optimistic, but mostly energizing and optimistic.
So as the chair of the Scott Trust, you have a lot of responsibility given the unique position of The Guardian in the media world.
Yeah, I'm not there yet, but I will be from September. Yeah, and you said the money's got to last 20 years. Well, actually, it's got to last in perpetuity. So there's less money than we think.
Global warming.
All right, okay. Just end on a really cheerful note. Thank you. So we have to be careful in the money, but we have got enough money to innovate our way through this. I mean, the people who are in the worst situation are the people. The Independent's just had to close its print edition because it's run by Russian oligarchs who obviously aren't as rich as people thought, and so that's going to internet only, which isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. But there are some there are some very fine papers that don't have £1 billion to the bank, and whose print editions are disappearing, and who are going to find it very, very tough.
Thank you very much.